"Stay here all winter," said the rancher. She replied, "Should we share the bed?" The landscape stretched endlessly before her. White fields broken only by the dark silhouette of a distant barn and a line of pines dusted in frost. She pulled her scarf tighter around her neck and adjusted the strap of her backpack. The city felt like another life now, far too loud, far too crowded, far too fast. Here, in the remote reaches of the country, everything moved slower. She needed that. She needed quiet. She needed a chance to breathe. The ranch was a small cluster of buildings nestled at the foot of a hill. A wooden fence zigzagged along the property, partially hidden by the heavy snow. Smoke curled lazily from the chimney of the main house, promising warmth and shelter. As she approached, the door opened and a man stepped out. He was tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in a heavy coat, and his face was tanned and weathered from years under the sun. His eyes, a pale blue, studied her carefully, as if measuring whether she could survive here. "You must be the new helper," he said, his voice calm and steady, carrying a faint drawl that made every word feel deliberate. "Yes," she replied, her voice quieter than she intended. The wind seemed to swallow words whole, and she felt the chill creep inside her bones. I'm here for the winter." "Winter," he repeated, as if tasting the word. "It gets cold out here, real cold. You sure about this?" She nodded. "I can handle it." He gave a short, approving nod and gestured toward the house. "Come on then, you'll need to unpack, get warm. And we'll talk about chores after." The front door creaked as he opened it, letting her into a world that smelled of wood smoke and something faintly sweet, probably the jam the rancher kept in jars on the shelves. The room was modest but cozy. A large fireplace dominated one wall, and thick rugs covered the wooden floor. A table sat near the window, stacked with a few books and a basket of knitting yarn. The air inside was dry but welcoming, a stark contrast to the bitter cold outside. "First things first," he said, removing his gloves and hanging them on a peg by the door. "You'll have your room upstairs, small but warm. If you need anything, it's in that chest. Clothes, blankets, that kind of thing." She followed him up a narrow staircase, her boots leaving wet tracks on the wooden steps. The room was indeed small, just enough space for a single bed, a wooden dresser, and a small table. A window looked out over the snow-covered fields, and she felt a strange flutter of excitement at the sight. She had never been this far from the city, this close to nature in its purest form. "Here you are," he said, opening the chest for her. "Winter's going to be long, but it's peaceful. If you're willing to work, it'll be good." She smiled, her nerves easing slightly. I like peace." He nodded once, then left her to settle in. She unpacked her few belongings carefully, laying out her clothes, setting her journal on the table. She had always written, always recorded her thoughts, but in the city it was hard to focus. Here, perhaps, she could write without interruption. Perhaps here she could finally listen to herself. After unpacking, she went downstairs. The rancher was chopping wood in the small shed beside the house. He moved with practiced precision, each swing of the axe deliberate, confident. Snow clung to his boots and coat, but he seemed almost immune to the cold. Watching him, she realized that life here required more than just physical strength. It required patience, endurance, and a respect for the land. "Need some help?" she asked, not sure if he wanted company. He glanced at her, measuring, then shrugged. "If you want. Wood doesn't mind if you're slow." She picked up a smaller log and tried to imitate his movements, swinging the axe carefully. She missed a few times and the log bounced awkwardly, but she laughed at herself. The sound seemed strange in the empty yard, almost too loud, but he only nodded and continued chopping. By the time the woodpile was organized, her hands were raw, her muscles sore, but there was a satisfaction in the work that was different from anything the city had offered. There were no deadlines, no screens demanding attention, no endless noise. Just her, the rancher, and the snow stretching into the horizon. Inside, the warmth of the fireplace was comforting. She sat on the edge of a chair, rubbing her hands together, feeling the ache from the day's labor. The rancher had started preparing dinner, moving around the small kitchen with quiet efficiency. He didn't talk much, but when he did, it was to point out practical things. Use that pot, soup first, then bread. She noticed how different this was from any job she'd ever had. There was no hurry, no boss hovering. There was trust. Trust that she would do her part, and that the work mattered because it kept the ranch running, not because someone would yell if she failed. It was a strange and liberating feeling. Dinner was simple, a thick vegetable soup with bread that smelled like it had been baked that morning. They ate in silence at first, but eventually conversation trickled out. The rancher asked her about herself, about the city, about why she had come. She spoke quietly, choosing her words carefully. He listened, really listened, and for the first time in a long while, she felt that someone was paying attention to her thoughts. As night fell and the fire crackled, she realized how different this life would be. She would rise early to tend the animals, chop wood, and keep the house warm. She would walk through the snow, feel the wind on her face, and watch the world shrink to the small boundaries of the ranch. And yet, even in isolation, she felt less alone than she had in the bustling city. Before heading to bed, she looked out the window. The snow had started falling again, soft and quiet, covering the world in a blanket of white. She imagined the long winter ahead, days blending together, work and quiet and reflection. Somehow it didn't feel intimidating. It felt possible. It felt like a place she could grow, learn, and maybe even heal. When she finally climbed into her small, warm bed, she thought about the rancher. There was something about him, steady, silent, reliable. She didn't know him well, not yet, but there was a sense of safety in his presence. And in the silence of the snow-covered night, that was enough. Outside, the wind howled, rattling the window panes, but inside, the room was still and warm. She closed her eyes, feeling the weight of the journey lift slightly from her shoulders. Winter would be long. It would be hard, but perhaps for the first time in years, she felt ready to face it. And somewhere in the quiet, as the snow fell endlessly into the night, she knew that this winter might change everything. The next morning, she woke to the sound of the wind whispering through the trees and the distant clatter of the barn doors. The sunlight was pale and weak, struggling through thick clouds that promised another day of snow. She pulled on her coat, boots, and gloves, determined to face the cold without hesitation. Her muscles still ached from the previous day, but there was a quiet satisfaction in that soreness. It was a reminder that she was alive, capable, and learning. Downstairs, the rancher was already awake, moving with the quiet efficiency of someone who had long been used to early mornings. He was feeding the animals. The cows lowed softly, the chickens clucked and pecked at the ground, and the horses snorted as he approached with buckets of feed. She watched him for a moment, impressed by the way he seemed completely at ease in this frozen world. "Morning," she said, stepping into the barn. Her voice sounded small in the vast space, but he didn't turn immediately. He simply nodded, a slight smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Morning," he said finally, tossing her a small bundle of hay. "Start with this. The animals need to eat, and it's better if it's done right." She caught the hay and began spreading it in the stalls. Her hands were stiff from the cold, but she worked carefully, mindful not to disturb the animals too much. The rancher moved beside her silently, performing his own tasks, and she realized that there was a rhythm here, one that didn't require words. Work was its own conversation, a language understood through actions rather than speech. By mid-morning, the chores were done, and the two of them trudged back toward the house. The snow had deepened, covering the tracks of their boots, making the world outside look like a vast, untouched white canvas. She paused at the window to watch a group of birds hopping across the snow, pecking for whatever scraps they could find. Their small, delicate movements seemed so fragile against the harsh winter, yet somehow they persisted. She felt a quiet kinship with them. Lunch was simple but satisfying, soup and bread again, warmed by the fire. She found herself watching the rancher as he moved around the kitchen. There was a calmness to him, a patience that came from years of routine and solitude. He didn't talk much, but when he did, it was always practical, direct, and never wasted on unnecessary words. She admired that quality. In the city, people seemed to talk endlessly without ever really saying anything. Here, words were chosen carefully, and that made each one meaningful. After lunch, he suggested a walk to check the perimeter of the property. She pulled on her coat again and followed him into the snow. The cold was sharper now, stinging her cheeks and fingers, but she welcomed it. Every breath she took felt clean and full, unlike the smog-laden air of the city. They walked for a while in silence, each step leaving fresh impressions in the snow. She learned to move carefully, balancing on the uneven surface, adjusting to the resistance of the thick winter layers. The rancher occasionally pointed out tracks in the snow, small footprints of rabbits, the faint drag of a fox's tail. She listened and observed, realizing that the world here demanded attention, demanded presence. In the city, she had been constantly distracted. Here, she could not afford to be. "Winter can be beautiful," the rancher said suddenly, breaking the silence. "If you look close enough." She nodded, taking in the quiet beauty around them. The snow sparkled faintly in the weak sunlight, the trees were heavy with ice, and the hills rolled gently into the distance. It was harsh, yes, but it was honest. There were no artificial lights, no constant noise, no rushing through life without noticing a single detail. As days passed, their routine became steady. She rose early, tended to the animals, chopped wood, and learned to cook basic meals. He taught her how to handle the chores efficiently, but never in a way that made her feel incapable. Instead, he guided her patiently, correcting mistakes gently, and praising her when she got things right. Slowly, trust began to grow between them. Not the flashy kind of trust that comes quickly, but the slow, steady trust of people who see each other every day, share labor, and rely on one another to survive in a harsh environment. One evening, as the wind howled outside and the snow fell relentlessly, they sat by the fire after finishing the day's work. She watched him carve small pieces of wood into simple shapes, a pastime he had picked up to pass the long winter nights. His hands were rough and calloused, but there was a careful delicacy in the way he worked. She asked him about it, curious. "Just something to pass the time," he said. "Keeps your mind busy, helps the hands remember they're alive." She smiled, realizing there was more meaning in those simple words than she could articulate. She began to carve a small piece of wood herself, clumsy at first, but gradually getting the hang of it. He offered pointers without pressure, and for the first time she felt the warmth of shared effort in more than just chores. There was a quiet companionship forming, built not on words but on presence, patience, and small acts of care. Winter deepened, and the days grew shorter. The nights were long, stretching endlessly, but she no longer felt fear or loneliness in the darkness. Instead, she found herself reading by the fire, writing in her journal, and learning more about the rancher with each passing day. He spoke rarely of himself, but small details slipped through. The way he remembered the animals' habits, the stories of past winters, the faint sadness in his eyes when the wind was especially cold. She realized that beneath his quiet exterior was a life shaped by hardships, yet tempered by resilience and care. One particularly stormy night, the wind rattled the windows and snow piled high against the door. They worked together to make sure the animals were safe, feeding them and checking the barns. Inside, the fire was lit, casting flickering shadows on the walls. They shared dinner in silence, the storm outside making their small cabin feel like a refuge from the world. She felt a strange comfort in his presence, a sense of safety she hadn't realized she was craving. The rancher noticed the way she lingered near the fire, shivering slightly despite her layers. He moved closer and handed her a thick blanket. "Wrap this around you," he said simply. She took it, and for a moment their hands brushed. It was fleeting, but it made her heart skip a beat. She realized that the long hours of shared labor, the quiet moments by the fire, and the trust built over small acts had created a bond stronger than words could describe. Even in the silence, she learned more about him than she had in any conversation in the city. She learned patience. She learned respect. She learned that connection didn't always need loud declarations. Sometimes it was simply being there, day after day, through harsh weather and long hours, sharing the small victories and struggles that made life meaningful. By the end of the second week, she was no longer the nervous newcomer. She moved with confidence around the ranch, handling animals with skill, chopping wood efficiently, and cooking meals that were nourishing and hearty. The rancher watched her progress with quiet satisfaction, rarely speaking but always observing, acknowledging her growth with a nod or a brief smile. One evening, after a long day, they sat together by the fire, watching the snow fall. The silence between them was comfortable now, filled with an understanding that had grown slowly, naturally. She felt a warmth in her chest, a feeling she couldn't quite name, and she realized that this winter, with all its challenges and hardships, was shaping her in ways she had never imagined. She looked at the rancher and noticed the subtle details, the way he focused on small tasks, the careful way he moved, the quiet strength that seemed to radiate from him. She realized that she was beginning to care, not just for the ranch, not just for the work, but for the man who had welcomed her into this frozen world and treated her with respect, patience, and quiet kindness. And as the fire crackled and the snow fell outside, she understood something important. This winter was not just a test of endurance or strength. It was a chance to connect, to trust, and to grow. And in this isolated, frozen landscape, she was beginning to find a place where she truly belonged. The snow had fallen heavier than ever during the night, covering the ranch in a thick, silent blanket of white. When she woke, the world outside her window looked almost magical, trees weighed down with frost, the fence lines barely visible, and the horizon blurred into a soft white haze. But magic came with a challenge. The snowstorm meant more work and careful planning. She quickly dressed in layers, pulled on her boots, and made her way downstairs. The rancher was already up, feeding the animals in the barn. The wind howled outside, rattling the walls of the small cabin. He looked up as she entered, giving her a nod. "Storm's worse than I thought," he said. "We'll need to double-check everything before it gets dark. Animals, fences, even the roof." She grabbed a broom and some tools, following him out into the snow. The cold cut through her gloves and coat, but she was ready. They moved efficiently, checking each animal, shoveling snow from paths, and making sure that the barns were secure. Even in the storm, there was a rhythm to their work. Every movement mattered. Every step had purpose. Hours passed, and the wind showed no signs of easing. Her cheeks were red, her fingers stiff despite the layers, but she felt alive in a way that city life had never offered. Every task completed was a small victory against the storm. At one point, she stumbled over a hidden patch of ice, and the rancher was there immediately, steadying her with a firm hand. "Watch your step," he said quietly, his gaze soft but serious. She felt a spark of warmth from the contact, not just from the physical touch, but from the silent reassurance that she wasn't alone. By late afternoon, the storm began to lessen slightly. Snow still fell, but the wind was calmer, and the worst of the cold was manageable. They trudged back to the house, exhausted but satisfied. The fire was already burning when they entered, the flames dancing in the hearth and filling the room with a comforting warmth. She peeled off her wet layers and wrapped herself in a thick blanket, feeling the heat seep slowly into her frozen body. They sat in silence for a while, listening to the storm's final whispers outside. She glanced at the rancher and noticed something she hadn't before, a quiet intensity in his eyes, a kind of focus that made him seem both strong and approachable at the same time. She felt a flutter in her chest she couldn't quite name, a strange mix of admiration and curiosity. "Long day," he said finally, breaking the silence. "Yes," she replied, "but it was good. I feel proud, I guess." He nodded. "Good, that's the feeling that keeps you going. Hard work is easier when you see it matter." Dinner that night was simple but hearty: vegetable stew, fresh bread, and a few slices of cheese. They ate quietly, but there was a warmth in the room that wasn't just from the fire. She noticed how comfortable it felt to be around him, how the silence between them was easy and not awkward. After dinner, they moved to the living area, each taking a seat near the fire. She picked up a small book she had brought from the city and began to read. Occasionally, he glanced her way, offering a small smile or nod when she looked up. There was a sense of companionship growing, built not on words but on presence. As the night deepened, the wind outside intensified again. The storm had not fully passed, and the snow drifted against the windows in thick layers. She heard a small creak from the roof and looked up, concerned. The rancher noticed her expression and stood. "Don't worry. It's normal in heavy snow. Just keep the fire going." She watched him move around the room with calm assurance. There was something about the way he handled everything, without panic, without unnecessary words, that made her feel safe. She realized that she had started to rely on him more than she wanted to admit. His presence had become a steady anchor in the isolation, a source of comfort in a world that could feel vast and unforgiving. Later, as the night grew colder and the storm raged outside, they settled near the fire. She sipped hot tea, feeling the warmth spread through her body. He sat across from her, quietly carving another piece of wood. The small movements of his hands, the concentration on his face, and the quiet hum of the fire created a cocoon of calm around them. "I've never seen snow like this in the city," she said softly, breaking the quiet. "It's beautiful but also dangerous." He glanced at her. "Yes, beauty and danger often live together. You just have to respect both." She nodded, feeling the truth in his words. Life here was about balance, understanding the land, respecting its power, and finding a rhythm within it. It was a lesson she had never truly learned in the city, where life moved fast and consequences often came too late. As the night wore on, the storm outside showed no signs of slowing. The rancher moved closer to the fire, noticing that she shivered despite her blanket. "Sit closer," he said simply. She obeyed, sliding her chair nearer to the warmth. Their shoulders brushed slightly, and she felt a small jolt at the contact. It was innocent, yet charged with something unspoken, a growing tension that neither of them addressed. They spoke a little after that, sharing stories of past winters and lessons learned on the ranch. He told her about the first winter he had spent alone after taking over the property, the challenges he faced, and the small victories that kept him going. She listened intently, fascinated by his resilience and quiet strength. She shared some of her own experiences from the city, though carefully, feeling the need to protect the softer parts of herself. Yet even in the restraint, there was honesty, and that honesty began to build trust. At one point, she laughed softly at a story he told about a stubborn horse that refused to be led into the barn. His smile was rare, subtle, but it made the firelight flicker differently in her mind, and she felt a strange warmth spread through her chest. She realized she looked forward to these moments, the shared laughter, the quiet companionship, and the small signs of human connection in the vast isolation. Later, when the wind rattled the windows again, she admitted quietly, almost to herself, that she felt a little afraid of the storm. The rancher noticed immediately. "It's all right," he said. "I'll stay here. Nothing's going to happen." His tone was steady, unwavering. She felt the tension in her chest ease slightly, replaced by trust and the comfort of knowing she wasn't alone. Hours passed and the fire burned low. They prepared for bed, the storm still raging outside. The rancher checked the animals one last time, making sure they were safe and warm. She followed him up the narrow staircase, feeling the closeness of their shared space more acutely than before. It was strange to feel this connection in so little time, but the harshness of the winter and the intimacy of shared effort seemed to accelerate feelings in ways neither of them could ignore. When she reached her room, she hesitated for a moment, glancing back at him. The storm outside made the house feel small and protective, and she realized how much she valued his presence. He nodded once, acknowledging her silently, and left the room to sleep nearby. She crawled into bed, wrapped in blankets, and stared at the ceiling, her mind swirling with emotions she couldn't quite name. It was in this quiet, isolated night, with the wind howling outside and the fire's warmth surrounding her, that she felt the first real stirrings of something deeper. Not just trust or admiration, but a connection that went beyond words. The winter was harsh. The world outside was cold and unforgiving, but here, in this small cabin, she felt a spark of warmth she hadn't expected to find. And as she drifted to sleep, listening to the storm and feeling the presence of the rancher nearby, she realized that this winter would change her in ways she had not imagined. Not just through hard work or survival, but through the quiet moments, the shared silences, and the subtle, unspoken bond forming between them. The storm had finally passed, leaving the world outside sparkling under a crisp, pale morning sun. The snow glistened like tiny diamonds, untouched and perfect, stretching endlessly toward the horizon. She woke to a quiet house, the soft light spilling through the frosted windows, and felt a calm settle over her. Winter here was no longer just a challenge. It had become a rhythm, a steady heartbeat that guided her days. She dressed quickly, eager to get outside and feel the crisp air on her face. As she descended the staircase, she noticed the rancher already tending the animals in the barn. He looked up and gave a small nod of acknowledgement. "Morning," he said, his voice calm but carrying the weight of routine. "Morning," she replied, a smile forming on her face. She stepped into the barn, feeling the warmth of the animals mixed with the icy scent of snow that clung to their coats. Today felt different. There was a sense of clarity in the air, a quiet expectation that something had shifted between them. They moved through their chores with practiced efficiency. She noticed that the rancher's eyes lingered on her occasionally, as if he were studying her, not critically, but with quiet care. She caught herself smiling when he offered simple guidance, a gentle correction here, a nod of approval there. The bond they had been forming over days of labor and shared silence seemed to deepen naturally, almost imperceptibly, but undeniably. After feeding the animals and stacking firewood, they moved back inside. She washed her hands and joined him near the fireplace. There was a comfortable silence, the kind that spoke louder than any conversation. She could hear the faint crackle of the fire, the occasional gust of wind rattling the windows, and the quiet hum of the rancher settling into his chair. "I've been thinking," she said softly, unsure where the words would lead. "About winter, about being here and about us." She paused, feeling her cheeks warm. The rancher looked at her, a flicker of curiosity and caution in his eyes. "Us?" he asked, his tone careful but not unkind. "Yes," she admitted, her voice steadying. I feel something. I don't know what it is exactly, but it's real, and I wanted to say it." For a moment, he didn't respond. He stared into the fire, his expression unreadable, and she felt her heart race. She had expected words, maybe even a rejection, but instead there was silence, long, deliberate, thoughtful silence. Finally, he spoke. "I feel it too," he said quietly, "but it's complicated." She nodded, understanding immediately. "I know, winter is hard. Isolation, it can make everything feel stronger, but I don't want to ignore it." He leaned back in his chair, letting the weight of his presence fill the room. "I've lived a long time on this ranch. I'm used to being alone, to handling things myself. It's not easy to let someone in." "I understand," she said softly, But maybe that's exactly why we should. Maybe it's not about the storm outside or the snow, it's about having someone to face it with. He studied her for a long moment, and she could see the conflict in his eyes. There was caution, yes, but also a growing warmth that he could no longer hide. "I've learned a lot this winter," he admitted finally. "About patience, about trust, about you." Her heart fluttered, a mix of relief and excitement coursing through her. She realized that their shared labor, the long hours, the quiet conversations by the fire, and even the silent glances during storms had brought them to this moment. There was no rush, no pressure, just honesty, raw and simple, grounded in the reality of the life they shared. As the day went on, they moved together around the ranch, completing chores with ease. Every glance, every small touch, every shared effort seemed heavier with meaning now. When she passed him a bucket of feed, their hands brushed and neither pulled away. When he helped her lift a heavy sack of grain, their eyes met, and a small, knowing smile passed between them. In the afternoon, she decided to take a walk in the snow, away from the barns and the house. The sunlight reflected off the frozen landscape, creating a world that felt both magical and serene. He followed her at a distance, giving her space but remaining close enough to offer support if needed. They spoke little, letting the quiet beauty of winter fill the space between them. At one point, they stopped at a small hill overlooking the ranch. The snow stretched endlessly below them and the distant hills rose softly in the sunlight. She turned to him, feeling the courage to speak again. I think I've never felt this connected to anyone," she admitted. "Not in the city, not anywhere. But here with you it feels right." He looked at her, his eyes softening. "It does," he said quietly. "It really does." They stood together, shoulder to shoulder, watching the snow drift in the gentle wind. For a moment, it felt like the world had narrowed to just the two of them, a bubble of warmth and connection amid the vast, frozen landscape. She felt a sense of safety she had never known, a trust so deep that it seemed to anchor her heart in a way she couldn't fully explain. As the sun began to dip toward the horizon, they returned to the cabin. The fire was lit, casting a golden glow across the room. Dinner was quiet, simple, but filled with unspoken understanding. She noticed how comfortable she felt in his presence now, how easy it was to share thoughts, hopes, and fears. The walls she had built around herself in the city were slowly crumbling, replaced by a sense of belonging and mutual respect. Later, as the night deepened, the wind outside rattling the windows once more, they sat near the fire, close enough that their legs touched beneath a shared blanket. The moment was innocent, yet charged with the emotions that had been building all winter. She could feel his warmth, his steady presence, and it made her heart race. She realized that this was more than trust or friendship. It was the beginning of something deeper, something neither of them needed to name just yet. She began, hesitating, unsure how to continue. "I'm glad I stayed this winter, even with the snow, the cold, everything. I'm glad I stayed." He looked at her, his gaze steady and unwavering. "Me too," he said simply. "Me too." They didn't speak again after that, not because there was nothing left to say, but because words were unnecessary. The silence between them was comfortable, filled with understanding and the quiet acknowledgement of the bond they had formed. Before heading to bed, they checked the animals one last time, ensuring that everything was secure. The rancher moved with quiet efficiency, and she followed, feeling the closeness of their shared responsibility. There was a trust here that went beyond words, an unspoken promise that they would face the challenges of winter together, supporting one another in ways neither had expected. When they finally retired for the night, she climbed into her bed, her heart full of emotions she couldn't yet name. The warmth of the fire still lingered in her mind, along with the memory of his steady presence nearby. She realized that this winter was no longer just a test of endurance or survival. It was a journey of connection, of trust, and of discovering the strength that came from allowing someone into her life. Outside, the wind had calmed, and the snow sparkled softly in the moonlight. Inside, the cabin was warm, safe, and filled with a quiet energy that spoke of new beginnings. She closed her eyes, letting herself feel the depth of what had grown between them, a bond forged through shared effort, honesty, and the willingness to be vulnerable in a world that demanded strength. And as sleep finally claimed her, she knew that this winter was no longer just about surviving the cold. It was about finding warmth, trust, and the courage to open her heart in a place where it was safe to do so. The days grew longer as winter slowly began to loosen its grip on the land. The snow that had once blanketed the ranch in endless white now began to melt in patches, revealing the first hints of green beneath. The air smelled different, crisper, cleaner, full of the quiet promise of change. She woke one morning to the sun streaming weakly through her window, feeling lighter than she had in weeks. Winter had been harsh, demanding, and at times overwhelming, but it had also given her something she hadn't expected, a sense of belonging and a bond that had quietly grown into something deeply meaningful. She dressed quickly, pulling on her boots and coat, eager to start the day. As she descended the stairs, she saw the rancher already in the kitchen, preparing breakfast with his usual calm efficiency. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting a warm glow across the room. She smiled, feeling the familiar comfort of routine and the quiet presence of someone who had become an anchor in her life. "Good morning," she said softly. He looked up and returned her smile, the rare warmth in his eyes brighter than the sunlight filtering through the windows. "Morning, ready for the day?" "Yes," she replied. "It feels different today, like the winter is ending but we're still here, and I'm glad we are." He nodded, acknowledging the unspoken words that hung between them. They moved through breakfast with ease, sharing small conversations about the day ahead, the animals, and the tasks that still awaited them on the ranch. There was a lightness in their interactions now, a sense of ease that came from trust, understanding, and the quiet connection that had grown over the long winter months. After breakfast, they stepped outside together. The snow underfoot was soft and slushy, melting in the morning sun, and the air carried a faint warmth. She breathed deeply, feeling the clean scent of the earth and the promise of spring. The rancher moved beside her, quiet but present, his steady steps matching hers. The silence between them was comfortable, no longer filled with uncertainty, but with the quiet acknowledgement of shared experiences and mutual respect. They worked together on the ranch, repairing fences, clearing snowdrifts, and checking the animals. Each task was lighter now, not just because the snow was thinning, but because they had learned to move together, to anticipate each other's actions, and to support one another without words. She realized that this bond, forged in the harshness of winter, had become a foundation, a sense of security and trust that could not be shaken. As the afternoon sun began to dip toward the horizon, they paused at a small hill overlooking the ranch. The snow was melting here, revealing the first shoots of grass and the dark soil beneath. She turned to the rancher, feeling the courage to speak openly about what had grown between them. "I can't imagine leaving this place," she said softly. "Not just the ranch, but you. I've never felt like this before, never trusted someone so fully, never felt so connected." He looked at her, the pale winter sun reflecting in his eyes. "I know," he said quietly. "I've felt the same. This winter, it's changed me too, made me realize I don't have to be alone. That it's possible to share life with someone you trust." The honesty in his voice warmed her more than the sun or the fire ever could. She took a small step closer, and he did the same, their presence near each other no longer a matter of distance but of choice. It was a quiet, deliberate closeness, the kind that spoke louder than words, filled with understanding, respect, and the subtle acknowledgement of their bond. They walked back to the cabin together, the snow crunching softly beneath their boots, and settled near the fire once more. She picked up her journal and began to write, capturing the feelings that had grown in her heart over the winter. He watched her for a while, then returned to his wood carving, the quiet companionship of shared space and mutual respect filling the room. In the following days, the work on the ranch continued, but it was no longer just about survival or routine. It was about living fully, appreciating the quiet moments, and sharing the small joys and victories with someone who understood. They laughed together over clumsy mistakes, celebrated small achievements, and spoke in brief, meaningful exchanges that carried the weight of their growing connection. One afternoon, as they repaired a section of fence near the barn, she paused to look at the rancher. The sun was warm on her face, the snow melting around their feet, and the world felt alive with possibility. She realized that winter had brought them closer, not just in proximity but in understanding. They had learned each other's strengths, weaknesses, and rhythms. They had faced challenges together, endured harsh storms, and come through stronger and more connected. "Thank you," she said softly, breaking the comfortable silence. "For what?" he asked, glancing at her. "For staying with me this winter, for trusting me. For letting me be part of your life." He smiled, a rare, full smile that reached his eyes and warmed her heart. "And thank you," he replied, "for staying, for working hard, and for being here. This winter, it wouldn't have been the same without you." Her chest swelled with warmth, and she felt a quiet happiness settle over her. She realized that the hardships of winter had been worth it, not because of the snow or the work, but because of the bond that had grown, the trust that had deepened, and the quiet love that had taken root. As the days passed and winter finally released its grip on the land, she and the rancher continued their work, but now with a new sense of hope and purpose. The melting snow revealed the first flowers of the season, and the air was filled with the promise of growth and renewal. She felt herself growing too, stronger, more confident, and deeply connected to the world around her, and to the man who had become such an important part of her life. One evening, after a long day of work, they sat by the fire once more. The cabin was quiet, the soft glow of the fire reflecting in their eyes. She leaned back in her chair, feeling content, safe, and deeply grateful. He glanced at her, his expression soft and unguarded. "It's been a long winter," he said quietly. "Yes," she agreed. "But it's been wonderful too, in ways I didn't expect." He nodded, reaching out to place a hand gently over hers. She felt a spark of warmth, a quiet reassurance that the bond they had formed was real and lasting. "Wonderful," he repeated, a small smile tugging at his lips. The night settled around them, quiet and calm. Outside, the world was slowly changing, the harshness of winter giving way to the promise of spring. Inside, there was warmth, trust, and the quiet joy of a connection forged through shared experience, patience, and honesty. As she prepared for bed, she paused to look out the window. The snow had melted in patches, revealing the first signs of life beneath. She realized that, like the land, she had grown this winter, stronger, wiser, and more open to the world and the people in it. The rancher's presence had been a steady guide, a source of support, and a reminder that connection and trust could flourish even in the harshest conditions. When she finally climbed into bed, she felt a sense of peace she had never known before. The winter had been long and difficult, but it had also been transformative. She had discovered resilience, trust, and the quiet joy of sharing life with someone who understood and cared for her. The rancher checked the animals one last time, ensuring everything was secure, then returned to the cabin. He stopped at her door, looking in with a gentle expression. "Good night," he said softly. "Good night," she replied, smiling. And as the fire burned low and the cabin settled into quiet, she knew that the winter had not only passed, but that it had given her something far more valuable: a sense of belonging, a deep connection, and the hope of a shared future. The snow outside continued to melt slowly, revealing the land in its new, bright form. The ranch was no longer just a place to survive. It was a home, a sanctuary, and a place where trust, patience and love had taken root. And in that quiet, golden light of the early spring, she felt ready to face whatever came next, not alone, but together with the man who had become her anchor, her friend, and something far more precious than she had ever imagined.